meeting. Dr. David James will be our speaker tonight, and the title of his talk is My Monarch Journey. His life has been entwined with the monarch butterfly ever since he laid eyes on it in a field guide when he was 8 years old in England. It remained a dream to follow it after he graduated from Salford University, and he lived in Sydney, Australia, where they commonly flew. He spent a decade researching the biology of Australian monarchs, culminating in a doctoral degree. And chapter 2 of his monarch research occurred here in the Western US this century. And of course, he's spoken often of it with us here at WBA. Recently, he journeyed back to Australia to revisit the populations that stimulated his thoughts and his views of the monarch. And his presentation tonight will weave his recent journey into his life's journey with the monarch. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, David.
Thank you, Paulette. I'll endeavor to share my screen.
Great. You're a pro now.
Okay, so yeah, this seems to be almost an annual occurrence, me talking about monarchs to this group. But this talk is going to be somewhat different, and it needs to be probably, because you're probably all getting sick of hearing me talk about my monarch research and other research that's going on. This is a bit more whimsical, I think, more biography, travel, a bit of research, just to remind you that I do research, and a bit wildlife documentary as well. And it is my monarch journey, and it's amazing to look back and see how much the monarch has been part of my life. And this is the time of my life, I guess, I should be looking back. So without further ado, we'll start at the beginning, which is about, I don't know, the early 1960s. I put 1966 here because I think that's the date, the year I was sitting on that rock in a lake in Snowdonia in North Wales. And that's actually a painting that my father did. He discovered he had a talent for painting in oils, late in life. He was in his 40s, and suddenly he just discovered how good he was. And that was one of his first paintings. And that's me sitting on a rock, being the model and being still. Actually, he didn't paint me. That was a photograph. It became a painting after the photograph. So that was around the time that butterflies suddenly became part of my life. And I've talked about this before. I think the fact that, I discovered butterflies about 8 years old by finding caterpillars in the garden and seeing tortoiseshell butterflies locally and peacocks and red admirals. And that book in the left-hand corner was a big part of my beginning, The Observer's Book of Butterflies, a small, cheap book. But it was the book that really introduced me to Britain's butterflies. And at that time, there was 68. And I think now there's only 60. So 8 have, gone by the by. And so, that book was instrumental in getting me interested in butterflies. And in the bottom right-hand corner is one of my early endeavors. I think it was for a high school project where I inventoried the butterflies of the Ivinghoe Hills. So I got 1966, 67, 68 there. So and the Ivinghoe Hills were about, I don't know, 10, 15 miles away from where I lived. And I cycled there down narrow country lanes. And those are the days when your parents let you do those sort of things, I guess. I don't remember having any close calls or anything. It was just perfectly natural to get on my bike and cycle that distance and spend the day at Ivinghoe Hills watching butterflies. And so I wrote that up and you see the word conservation there. So, conservation has been on my mind a long time. So this is the Observer's Book of Butterflies, and the first page is the milkweed butterfly, the monarch. They called it the milkweed butterfly. And, that was like, it took a whole page. All the other butterflies, as you can see from the bottom there, took, a third of the page. So this was the big butterfly that we rarely saw. Occasionally it would turn up on the south coast because it had been blown over about this time of year. But I never saw one there, obviously. So it was the unattainable goal. So, but I was into butterflies, and I knew what I wanted to do. One of those rare kids that knew what they wanted to do. So when I left high school, I went to University of Salford, and this is me on my graduation day with three of my friends, after having completed my degree in zoology and geography. So, I really wanted to be an entomologist, but I was open to being a wildlife specialist of some sort, working in a national park. And so, after graduation, I tried to find a job in England first, and then it was hard. I was driving trucks and working in warehouses. Couldn't find a job in the UK at all. This was 1975. I started applying for jobs in Africa and all sorts of places, game parks, and this is the days of writing letters, of course. So everything was frustratingly slow. But eventually, I migrated to Australia, which being English was fairly easy to do. So I landed there in 1976, and within a few weeks, I got a job as not an entomologist, but as a technician in entomology with the New South Wales Department of Agriculture. And my duties were, as you see there, the laboratory bioassay of insecticides against spider mites and locusts. So not exactly butterflies, but it was an entomology job, and that's what I wanted. And it was interesting. I became actually an acarologist. Amongst my other skills, I'm an acarologist. I know a fair bit about spider mites and predatory mites and insecticides in particular. So as most I've been an agricultural entomologist for a lot of my life, but butterflies have always been the backbone, I guess, of my interest. And so within 2 years, earlier than that, actually, I'm noticing butterflies in the Sydney area. Sydney was downright tropical compared to Hemel Hempstead, Hertfordshire in England. And so butterflies were there in abundance. And the monarch was there. And so I was just, my fantasy had come true. I could see monarchs flying around, laying their eggs, doing what they do commonly in certain places and around the outskirts of Sydney. And so, I just became involved in them, and obviously, being a biologist at heart and a researcher, I wanted to know more about them, and found out that there really wasn't much known about the monarch in Australia. And so, I just started studying them, basically, simple as that. I had no lofty designs of further degrees or anything else. I was just working on weekends with monarchs and other butterflies, but particularly monarchs. So that's where my journey began. And so, my colleagues in the Agricultural Institute, the Department of Agriculture, said, well, you should put this to use. You should do a master's degree on it, or even a PhD. And so I did. I enrolled for a master's, and then it became obvious that it was too big, all that I was doing. I was a biologist, so I was looking at everything, from physiology to ecology. And so I felt that if I was going to do this, that it should become a PhD, and others encouraged me to do that. And so to do that, I had to, to transfer, I had to give this grand presentation. And who was there in the audience but Lincoln Brower? And if you know about monarchs, Lincoln Brower is the guru of monarchs. And I obviously knew about him then because I was, looking at all the papers on American monarchs, and he was like, the monarch guru, as I said. And so for him to actually be in Sydney at the time and to be at my presentation, he actually wanted to talk to me because he published a couple of papers by then, I think. And so it's very serendipitous that he was there, and I think he was a big part in me being able to transition from the master's to the PhD. And so the PhD was done part-time. I was still, working in my day job, but in my other time I was working on the PhD. And so basically 78 to 88. I actually graduated or completed my PhD in 84, but I continued because there was unfinished business to do. And so, we're going back a long time, obviously. And so there's my, example of my notebook, and a lot of the work I was doing was basic, but obviously migration was a great interest even at that time. So tagging was important, and to get results from the tagging, I had to generate publicity. And that was easy to do, remarkably easy to do in Sydney at that time. Just write to a journalist or a newspaper or a TV station, and you get coverage. And so this, that picture there is an example, and I'll go through a few more. Just these early stages of the tagging program. I think at the bottom there it says David James, 27, a technical officer. And so, there I am, hanging up my monarch pupae. But it was covered. It was, part of publicity for the program. And in those days, tags were not available from Monarch Watch as they are now. With the Western Monarch tagging program, I get my tags from Monarch Watch, and they're all printed and nice and everything. I don't have to do anything. In those days, I had to write them myself. So this tag was actually handwritten, and I did thousands of these tags, by hand with a type of a fountain pen with special ink that wouldn't fade, and that's just a number and a telephone. So yeah, that took a lot of time, but I was pretty dedicated, enthusiastic in those days. And there's some example of the publicity. My hopes were soaring. I had endless, publicity. I think people, so everybody knew about tag monarch butterflies, which contributed to the success of the tagging, of checking where the wanderers go. And the monarch in Australia is called the wanderer butterfly. And that's another example, rare butterflies released, always, looking for an angle for a photo opportunity. And I even got my son at that time, my first son, on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, with a butterfly. So, cuteness overload. And but it was all, to get in, the major newspapers, Sydney, was, incredible. And the phone calls just followed with people finding the tag monarchs. And TV was another part of it as well. This is I think it was a TV news segment, but I also went on a chat show where I met Ernest Borgnine and a couple of other relatively famous people, and sat down with the interviewer for a chat show and released some monarchs in the studio, which is a bit silly in retrospect because they went to the lights, and I think probably didn't fare too well. But yeah, it was just an amazing time. They even made the glossy magazines. This is the centre spread from the Australian Women's Weekly. The same story, telling them about what we're doing with the tags, and other aspects of the biology of the monarch too. And they just lapped it up. And it was all, very important for generating the publicity I needed. They even had some more serious interviews as well with more environmental, serious magazines or, newspapers. So it was all good. And I was busy, doing things scientifically too. And I wasn't, at that time, I'd never written a scientific paper. And so, I had a lot to thank my colleagues for at the Department of Agriculture for encouraging me to write things up. I was always a writer, I always wanted to write. Journalism was something I thought about doing as well. And even, writing books and being a Bob Pyle, crossed my mind a few times as well. So writing was definitely something I wanted to do, but scientific writing was something different altogether. And so I needed to learn that. And I had my colleagues at the Department of Agriculture to thank for that. So this is my first scientific paper in 1979. And it was basically a very simple study on the observations on two overwintering clusters of the monarch in the Sydney area, and both of these were two new clusters, two new colonies. So there was some information on monarchs in Sydney prior to my work, but it was very limited, and that limited information did show that there was monarch overwintering in Sydney at certain clusters, but not the clusters that I found. So I thought this was worthy of reporting in this scientific paper. And then the second paper, which was just a year or so later, were studies on the winter breeding population. That was very significant because prior to my work, winter breeding in Sydney was not a thing. In the previous work, just a decade prior, or less than a decade, about 8 years, there was no winter breeding observed. So something had changed in that time to allow winter breeding to occur. And so this paper documented that. And that's significant because of the current situation in the Western US and winter breeding now occurring in some parts of California, San Francisco most recently. So that draws in some parallels that I'll talk more about as we go along. So this is Camden, which was the first overwintering site reported upon previously by Courtney Smithers, who worked at the Australian Museum. And he was the guy that worked on the monarch before me. I think he was the only person that published seriously on the monarch, and he published, I think, 2 or 3, maybe 4 papers on the monarch. And I was able to talk to him and meet him and get a lot of information from him. He was a great help in what I was doing at the time in my PhD. And so this site was home to up to 40,000 overwintering monarch butterflies in the early 1960s. But by the time that I started working, 78 to 84, the numbers were much lower, maximum of about 3,000 and often just 1,000, 2,000. So there was apparently a substantial decline in that short period of time, which again, rings bells to everybody listening, I hope, in the fact that, our population in the US has also declined in a short period of time, over a decade or so. This seemed to have happened in Australia as well at this time. So at the top part of the slide is the grand thesis that came from this work, and so the 2 papers I've mentioned already came out of it, and another 10. So there was a dozen papers that came from this PhD, and probably the 2 most important papers are these 2 physiological papers, behavioural papers, which I think I've mentioned before in talks, because they pertain a lot to what's happening in the US with monarchs. The top one is the nature of ovarian dormancy in monarchs, in reproductive dormancy, and the fact that in Australian monarchs anyway, it was fairly labile. It was they're able. I concluded it wasn't a form of diapause. So I went into a great deal of detail about the differences between diapause and other sorts of dormancy, and the one that I talk about here is called oligopause, which is a kind of diapause, but it's more flexible, basically. So it means that instead of being rigidly controlled by physiology, Australian monarchs seem to be much more flexible. And interestingly, we still don't know with American monarchs what sort of dormancy they have. I mean, I'm assuming that most of the eastern monarchs anyway have, because there's been limited work on them, have a rigorous diapause, because the fact that I hypothesized that oligopause was an adaptation to Australian conditions, which are far more benign than they are in the US, i.e., migration and clustering occurs in Australian monarchs, but it's not as essential as it is in the US. For example, a monarch cannot survive the winter in Minnesota, but a monarch could survive the winter in inland New South Wales or Victoria in certain years, because they don't get minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit or even 20 degrees Fahrenheit. it's just a few degrees below freezing, perhaps most of for a few hours on some nights. And so the need to actually leave their summer breeding areas is not as essential. So I link that to the fact that the dormancy has changed with the monarch there, because it's not as essential to maintain it as much as it is in the US. They definitely need to be more rigid in their dormancy and not get tricked into becoming reproductive too early, because our climate is or was more harsh. Anyway, I'm not going to go into all that. I promise not to be too research orientated in this talk, but that's important. And also the induction of reproductive dormancy is the other important thing. And again, that's something else that hasn't really been worked out in American monarchs. But I found there that despite the photo period that the butterflies were reared at, the reproductive dormancy was induced in the newly emerged individual. So in the first 3 or 4 days of life, if they experience temperatures below about 18 degrees centigrade, which is, about 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's cloudy, and so they can't warm themselves. So if they have a cool 3 or 4 days, then they migrate and become, clustering, overwintering individuals. But if, in contrast, they close in conditions that are very warm, above that temperature and sunshine, then they don't, regardless of the time of year. It can be autumn and the days shortening. They will continue breeding and not become migratory and overwintering. So again, I hypothesize that was an adaptation to the fact that the climate was more benign there. So this is very remarkable, and this is a theme of the whole talk, really, in the adaptability of the monarch, because the monarch arrived in Australia in 1870. So I did these studies just about 100 years after it arrived there. So we don't know what the status of the butterflies was when they arrived, of course. I mean, if they island hopped across from Hawaii, they may have changed their physiology long before they got to Australia. But the point is that they have changed their physiology and adapted to the more benign conditions. So that is just remarkable, I think, their adaptability to be able to do that in a short period of time. So moving on. So the main points that I learned about monarchs during my PhD, well, the new overwintering sites, I discovered more than 2. I can't remember how many now, but I'm going to be talking about that more in a minute. So that was the first thing. The evidence for winter breeding was another very important thing. The evidence for migration, we didn't, before my work, we didn't have evidence for migrations. The tagging proved that. The cues for migration and dormancy, as I've just described, were all new. The flexible reproductive dormancy is very important. And the population decline that occurred, but apparent resilience. They were still, despite their lower numbers, they appeared to be resilient populations. And that's true of today, as you'll see as I get through this talk. And as I just said, the extraordinary adaptability. Even at that time, I mentioned in my PhD that I felt that they were very adaptable, because that's what my PhD had shown, really, looking at Lincoln Brower's work and other people's work in the US at that time. They were doing very different things, the Australian monarchs, than the US monarchs. So things have changed. And that's why Lincoln was interested in what I was doing, because I was finding different things. And yeah. So insights for Western monarchs. Well, I've talked about these in more details in the past in other talks, of course. But it showed me, the work there, that populations can thrive at low level and don't panic. There's a tendency for people to panic when we get low levels of butterflies. And as Chip Taylor says, they're not going to disappear. They're going to be okay even at low levels. I mean, it's disappointing for us to see them at low levels, but we're pretty confident that they're going to survive. And the Australian story gives credence to that. They are fully functional. Sorry about this. On on non-native milkweed. So all the milkweeds in Australia are non-native. They're African milkweeds, and they do all the things that USA monarchs do in terms of dormancy and migration, etc. So and that's another thing. There's a tendency for people here to get very worked up about non-native milkweeds as possibly having an impact on the behavior and physiology of monarchs. And I've spoken at length about this before. That's not going to be the case, in my opinion, based on my Australian work. They're fully functional on non-native milkweeds. They respond to a warming climate by breeding in winter. I didn't at that time. I didn't look at the data on whether there was a warming climate at the period of time in the 70s and 80s, but there probably was. But I think it's very likely that they do respond to a warming climate, and what we're seeing now in California supports this view. Reproductive dormancy is flexible. That's very important. And I think there's a degree of flexibility in our dormancy, our monarch dormancy too, and maybe more so in Western monarchs than Eastern monarchs. That research has got to be done. And the resilience and adaptability rule, they're the things that the monarch is guided by. So fast forward to 2019, and I wanted to do a review of the earlier research. I was disappointed at this time, getting on in years myself, and that not much had been done since I left. And unfortunately, the monarch in Australia is not revered as it is here. Well, that's changing a little bit now. I don't know why, but it is, I think. It's not native, so people are a bit snobbish about it, I guess, and don't put it in the same category as Ulysses butterflies and bird wings and all the other butterflies that might be threatened. But I did hope that other people would take up the baton and do some more work on Australian monarchs, but nobody did. So it was up to me again to do something, and a lot of time had gone by. So I wanted to review the earlier research and stimulate other researchers, hopefully. So I did this work with my sister Teresa, and she was a botanist and had a long research career, and always wanted to write a paper with her. And this is the opportunity, and the opportunity came about because she actually had a population, overwintering population on her property. She lived some way north of Sydney in the country, and monarchs started overwintering at her place. And that was the furthest north that overwintering monarchs have been seen. So that alone was a stimulus to write this paper. But we reviewed the earlier research. We identified 33 monarch overwintering sites in New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and South Australia. From my work and other work that had been done, and other work that I'd missed in my earlier work, because with today's technology, it's far easier to find references than it was back in 1984, apparently. So there was an increase of 12 since 1984. And then we described the overwintering site near Wingham in New South Wales, which is where Teresa lived, which was the most northerly to date. And finally, we made a plea for more research and monitoring, like just simple things like annual status. We need a Xerces. There's no comparable Xerces society over there, or Thanksgiving count, something like that. And so, hopefully that will happen one day. And so Teresa's property hosts the most northerly overwintering site. Sadly, she passed from cancer just after our paper was published, but I was able to show her the paper, give her the paper the last time I saw her, actually, and I went over there in late 2019, just before she passed. So that was very sad, and I'm very glad that we did what we did, wanted to do, and it's just sad that she passed. But back in last year, 2023, she had this reserve in Sydney, the western suburbs of Sydney. So if you're ever in the western suburbs of Sydney in Penrith, a place called Penrith, look out for the Teresa James Reserve. And this is quite a large natural reserve that's in the western suburbs, and it's preserved hopefully for all time and under her name. And she was a botanist, as I said, and she did a lot of survey work for local councils for conservation planning and such like, identifying the rare species and such like. And so it's a great honor, I think, that she's been commemorated in this way. And so now even more up to date, just last month, actually, September, I had a paper published along with Chris Sanderson and his mum, surprisingly. Chris Sanderson's a student I met in November 2023 at a butterfly conference in Australia. And I gave a presentation on monarchs, and he spoke up and said, "Did you know monarchs cluster in Brisbane?" I said, "No, they don't. It's too far north." And anyway, we spoke afterwards, and sure enough, long story short, there are, or there were, and there are sometimes in some years, overwintering colonies at two sites, 305 miles north of Wingham, which is where Teresa lived, or about 480 miles north of Sydney. So this is way north, and really extraordinary. I couldn't believe that, because some of you are not familiar with Australia, I'm sure, but this is Queensland, and Brisbane, Queensland is subtropical. Well, Sydney is sort of subtropical, so this is more tropical than Sydney is, and basically there really is not much of a winter there. And so initially I wondered how could they get the cues to become migratory and overwintering when they live in such a climate. But and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But so they were discovered at this site called Oxley. It's Oxley Creek Common, that I'll talk more about in a minute. In 2020, which was COVID year, and he told me about it at the conference. And but there are also other sightings too on iNaturalist. But this is a map of Australia to show how far north it is. So the pins there show the overwintering sites. So you see them in New South Wales, and you see the two new ones in Queensland, and how much further north they are. A couple in Victoria and a couple in South Australia. I'll talk more about them in a minute. So this is...
Excuse me, David, you did mention Tasmania a few minutes ago. Are there none in Tasmania?
Not in Tasmania, but Flinders Island, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Flinders Island is just north of Tasmania, which is part of... it's considered part of Tasmania, but it's not actually in Tasmania. So yes, they're there. So back to Brisbane, Queensland. So Oxley Creek Common is a park and a natural area surrounded by suburbs and industry. So it's right in the suburbs. So this is a Google Earth image of the Oxley. So this is the Oxley Creek, and this is the common and sort of designated natural area. Some of it's marshy and swampy, so they can't really develop it, fortunately. It's a great bird area. And that's where the monarchs were, in the middle of suburbia. And a search of iNaturalist, after Chris told me about this, revealed other sightings at Oxley, all in 2020. There was a couple of other sightings in some other years too, but mostly in 2020. And iNaturalist doesn't go back that far. I mean, I think it goes back to I can't remember, maybe 2010. But people really didn't use iNaturalist much until recent years. So we don't really know how recent of a phenomenon this is, them clustering in Brisbane. So this is again a Google Earth image of the sites, and so the other site, there's Oxley Common right in the metropolitan area, suburban area, but then there's St Helena Island, and that's Chris's mum found them in the same year on St Helena Island, and we have pictures in the new paper that was published. And so there's no doubt that they were overwintering there too. So there must have been, my work that I did in the 1980s, showed that the migrants generally moved in a northeasterly direction, which is the opposite of here, of course. Southwesterly, being in the southern hemisphere, they're moving northeasterly. So if we assume that they're moving northeasterly, then they probably came from somewhere, to the southeast. And this, where this blue arrow thing is, is the Great Dividing Range, which is a highland area. So it's not like the Cascades or anything, but it's relatively high. I think it's maybe 1,000 meters. Could be wrong. Could be higher than that. But the point is that during the autumn, they do get periods of time when the conditions are right for induction of reproductive dormancy using the information I got on Australian monarchs back in the 80s. Temperatures are below 60 degrees for a few days. It's usually associated with rain and cloud, being in the mountains, the high elevation. And so the conditions do occur, and milkweed occurs there too. So the great iNaturalist allows us to see all the reports of milkweed in the dividing range. So there's no doubt it could be a breeding area too. So even just theoretically anyway, it is possible that certain populations could receive the right conditions to migrate. And then this year in April, I was astounded to find on iNaturalist again somebody posting this obvious little cluster of monarchs at a place in the dividing range. So it was a transient roosting site because it was, people went there shortly thereafter after I made a fuss about it, and they weren't there anymore. So it was, and my earlier work in the 80s discovered a number of transient roosting sites where they'd roost for a few days and then move on. So this was one of them. So it does happen. It clearly the condition, and looking back at the weather and the temperatures prior to this, there were conditions that would have been suitable. So this may have been happening for a long time, unobserved, undiscovered. I do think that people are more, things like iNaturalist, and people looking at things more, perhaps we're just seeing things better now than we used to. And so it may have been going on a while. Anyway, so with all this happening, I wanted to go back to Australia and look at the overwintering populations myself after all this time. So I wrote a quick proposal, small proposal to Australian Entomological Society. They were offering a few $1,000s for studies on Australian insects, and I was fortunate enough to be granted it. So I just wanted to survey some of the historical overwintering sites that I looked at, back in the 80s, and do some population counts and basic stuff, and look at the newly discovered sites in Brisbane, and also to look at some other sites that I discovered on iNaturalist, from other people's images that looked like overwintering sites because they had pictures of more than one monarch. So I wanted to check those out too. So my first stop was Queensland, and I turned up at Oxley Park with some big monarchs floating around, or actually just one. It turned out to be an environmental festival on the common on that particular day that I was there. And so just ironically, there was this young lady on stilts pretending to be a monarch. Not quite the monarch I was looking for, but she was there. And so looking around, I found the milkweed. So this is the other thing about Australian overwintering monarchs and overwintering sites, and I've mentioned this before many times. Milkweed is always present. 99% of the time you'll find milkweed. And as I mentioned, the milkweed there are all non-native, and this is Gomphocarpus fruticosus, or swan plant. And that's how I knew it when I was working on them back in the 80s, the nice swan plant, because the seed pods, with their little stalk, I think, sort of gave somebody the image of a swan, perhaps. So I thought that was nice. But Americans want to call it hairy balls. I can't think why, but that's the name that we give it here. I don't know that it's officially accepted, but the common names are never officially accepted, really. But this is what most people call this species in the US, and you can get it in California from nurseries under the name of hairy balls. So this is where the monarch clusters were in 2020, and sadly in 2024, in July, when I went, there was none there. And Chris had been checking, my co-author from the paper, prior to my visit, and he didn't see any either. But that's typical for Australian overwintering colonies, that they weren't, you know, even back in the day, they weren't always occupied every year. And that's the sense I get for a lot of them now anyway, anecdotally. Nobody's, you know, studied them properly, but that's the sense that I get. And I think if you looked at California overwintering sites, I think you find some sites that don't always get occupied every year. There was a small population of breeders present, so I was happy to see a few monarchs around. And you can tell the breeders because they're chasing each other, they're hanging around the milkweed. There's females laying eggs, and so they were there in small numbers. But you know, I was there on sort of a whimsical tour, so I was looking at other natural history too. And you know, being on iNaturalist now, I can't resist just putting everything on that I see, and so I've become a birder of sorts. A bit ironic since most of the times it's birder, sky, and butterfly people. But so this is a very cute little bird that I saw at Oxley Creek Common. Turned out to be a rainbow bee eater. I had no idea, but very cute little birds. So when I didn't fly around the country, I drove. I like driving. I've always liked driving, and so it was the big drive. I drove from Queensland to New South Wales, then over to South Australia, and then back again across the outback to Brisbane. About 2,500 miles. And so I think that's the best way to see the country, to be honest. And it was great catching up with, you know, all the sites and places that I've known from my past. Some days I had company and a lot of things that I could take note of and put on iNaturalist, like these emus here. And this is, you know, one of the things that I had to get used to in my early days in Australia in the mid 1970s. The Australian huntsman spiders, which are huge, you know, up to 6-inch leg span, and you know, and on a wall like that, it's okay. I mean, they're frequent visitors in houses, so you're always going to get them in the house, even in the suburbs of Sydney and all the other major cities. They'll wander in and cause people to scream. People call them tarantulas, and so you know that didn't worry me too much. But what did worry me a little bit is when they unexpectedly ran across the car dashboard when you're driving down the road at 70 miles an hour. That is really off-putting, and I have to say I you know have almost almost died in circumstances like that, trying to you know, control the car. And sometimes it'd be on the visor. You pull the visor down, and one of these spiders falls down. So yeah, but the point is they're not harmful. They're quite harmless. In fact, a lot of kids over there, Australian school kids, actually keep them as pets. So this was another butterfly I saw a lot of when I was there in July, which is a butterfly I dreamt about researching and looking at its migrations, because nobody really knows the reasons why it migrates some years and not others. It's a white butterfly, but you know, it's a Pieridae butterfly, but it's black and red and yellow, as you can see, so beautiful. The larvae feed on mistletoes, and it's common, but we don't know a great deal about it. Okay, so New South Wales, my first stop was a place near Gloucester. There's a lot of English names in Australia, which it's a bit like New England. You go to New England and an English person feels right at home. And it's a bit like that in Australia too. So Gloucester is a very English name, English town. And this is an overwintering site that was discovered by somebody, a citizen scientist, a person actually, who contacted me years ago. And at that time, it had hundreds. It was a really good site. But this year, there was only about a dozen butterflies there. It was still occupied by what I thought were overwintering butterflies. They certainly were behaving like that, but just a very small number. It's the gully. There's a gully over there where they mostly occur in, and there's milkweed all down the road and near the gully itself, as in all the other overwintering sites. There were wallaroos in this area, which is some of you may not have heard of them, but they're sort of like a cross between a wallaby and a kangaroo, I guess. I can't tell the difference, but our naturalists can tell you. And then there's the Australian brush turkeys, which I never saw much of in the 80s because they weren't very common then. But now apparently they occur in most Sydney suburban gardens, causing problems by building they build big mounds for laying their eggs in, and so they dig up a lot of gardens, and so they're causing a lot of people a lot of problems. And because they're native animals, they're native birds, they're not allowed to be killed or anything. And they were near extinction 100 years ago, but now, as I say, they're an increasing suburban pest. So this is Wallacea, a place called Wallacea, which which is actually the site of one of the first my first paper described 2 new overwintering sites, and this was one of them. It looked pretty much like this in those days, except now there's a bit of a hedgerow around the outside and trees around the outside, so you can't look in from the road as much as you could before. But the actual site where the butterflies congregated in these trees here is pretty much the same. But disappointingly, I didn't find many butterflies there. So this is just a map to get you your bearings. Kapara is right at the top, which is where my sister Teresa had her overwintering colony at her place. And then there's Gloucester, which is not far from her place. And then there's other sites here I went to, but I'm not going to talk about. And then there's Wallacea over here in the western suburbs of Sydney, and Camden, which is the next one I'll talk about in a minute. So at Wallacea, the late 1970s, I'd get about 1,000 or more butterflies there overwintering. This year, I could find 2. They were very, I think they were overwinterers because they were very, they showed great fidelity to the site, and they, they were roosting on the trees when they stopped, and but 2 is obviously disappointing to see. But again, even in those days long ago, we wouldn't always get large numbers every year, but it might only be 100. I can't recall only being 2 though, I must admit. There was a lot of lantana there, and lantana is important for overwintering monarchs in Sydney area, in particular, and probably other areas too. It's a noxious weed in Australia, and there's biocontrol programs to control it, but it's still prevalent, and it is an important nectar source for overwintering monarchs. So it was still present, just in small quantities. This was taken at another site, wasn't as big as this, but it certainly. I think that previous picture was on the lantana, so very much favoured. I always love to see the Australian wattles. There's lots of yellow wattles, but there's some white species too. And winter's the time to see flowering wattles. And in fact, winter in Sydney is, as I mentioned earlier, it's very benign. It's it's not really the winter. It's not a Seattle winter, obviously. And so you can see a lot of wildflowers and even butterflies and lots of birds, of course, like this noisy miner on a grevillea flower. That's it. And this is a honey eater, so they're seeking honey, probably pollinators too. So this is Camden, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the site, the first overwintering site discovered in Australia in 1962, where there were large populations up to 40,000. In 64, there was 15,000. And then when I was working, it was about 2,000. And this slide, or it was a slide at the time, taken in 1980, shows what it looked like then. And that's what it looks like now. I couldn't take the same picture because, again, it's hidden from the road. I mean, in the previous picture, I was standing on the road and there was nothing, in front of me. But now there's all trees in front of the site. So I'm actually in the site here, looking back in the opposite direction. And it's these trees that we see in the other slide, just on the other side of the trees looking. So the trees are still there. intact, and but the configuration of the site has changed because there's more trees around. It's not an isolated population of trees again. But I was happy to see a larger population there. If 14 is larger than 2, and they were definitely overwinterers because they were all in the one spot, sometimes aggregating on branches together. The weather wasn't perfect when I was there, so there may have been more than that there because it's quite a large site. So it's after all these years, it's still being used, albeit by low numbers. And of course, going there just once is a snapshot sort of view. So, next year there could be 1,400, who knows? That's why we need somebody else to do this work, unless someone's going to pay me to go there every year. The milkweed is still present there as it was in the past. The land that's on is farmland, so it's grazed, and it needs to be, so that there's still some open areas there. And milkweed is still there. And there's caterpillars, and this was one of the sites back in the 80s that I discovered caterpillars for the first time, whereas Courtney Smithers in the previous work never found signs of breeding. So they're still reproducing during the winter. And they were mostly, when I was there, basking and roosting, as I said. There was also the lesser wanderer butterfly, and that's the butterfly shown here, which was always present at the same time. They don't overwinter, they don't cluster. They continue breeding throughout the winter. Always did, well, they did. I'm not sure about prior to my work, but they certainly were during my work. And so I was happy to see them there at this site as well, which was a site that they were commonly found at all these years ago. And that's the caterpillar of one of the lesser wanderers too. I also found more wallaroos at this site, having a bit of a Barney. There you go, having a little boxing match. So that was cool to see. And the laughing kookaburra. So if you've never been to Australia, and you really should go. This isn't really a travelogue, I don't think, but maybe it is. And one of the bird life over there is incredible. And the laughing kookaburra is such an iconic thing. And I wish I knew more technology to put in a sound file here. I could have played you the laugh, but go and look it up afterwards. It's such an iconic thing, and they're everywhere. And almost every place you lay your head in the night, overnight, and wake up in the morning, the odds are that you'll have a kookaburra serenading you in the morning. So it's another one of those things that's distinctly Australian, as much as koalas and kangaroos, but doesn't get the same publicity, I guess. That's the scarlet grevillea, one of Teresa, my sister's favourite plants. So continuing my journey south, heading to Victoria, which is the southernmost state apart from Tasmania. And there's only, historically only 2 overwintering sites known from this state. And it's never really had good populations of monarchs in the past. It's always been cooler summers, and probably that was the reason why the weather was not quite good enough for monarchs, perhaps. So only 2 overwintering sites, and I visited the other one, but I won't talk about it. It was a bad day. It was raining. But this is the other one, Griffiths Island, a place called Port Fairy. And so there we go back to the map again, and you can see Port Fairy to the left over there, on the coast again. And so like the Western US overwintering sites, Australian sites are coastal. Most of them are not as coastal, not as close to the coast as California sites, but they're within the vicinity. But there are some exceptions, of course, like the Oxley site and also my sister Teresa's site, which is a fair way inland. Anyway, Port Fairy, in 2013, hundreds were seen there, so that was significant. And I was contacted by people from Australia at that time, and so got pictures sent, and there's an example of them roosting on this tree that you wouldn't have seen before. Maybe it's called the Norfolk Island pine. Not a true pine, southern hemisphere type pine tree, very distinctive. They're endemic to the North to Norfolk Island, and now in other places too. And that's what they were roosting on. I mean, it's obviously very pine-like, so you can see why they would like it. But unfortunately, when I was there and I had a good look around on a good day, not a monarch to be seen, sadly. I did see a brown fur seal though, just lazing around. But then sort of a crowd came around and he showed himself off a bit. So that was cool to see. I hadn't actually seen one of them, not on land like that. And then the birds were there too. Another beautiful parrot, rosella. There's a number of rosellas, just spectacularly coloured. And then the sulphur-crested cockatoos, which if the kookaburras are common, then the sulphur-crested cockatoos are just common. And their calls and their sound are not quite as nice as the laughing kookaburra, much more raucous, and you're going to hear them in the morning as well, but full of character. And you've probably seen them in zoos and such like, but they're everywhere in Australia, very common and often very tame too. Okay, so Flinders Island. So this is an interesting one, and sadly, I didn't get to Flinders Island on my trip. I was planning to, but circumstances intervened. But I've got a contact there who keeps me updated on what's happening. And the colony there is quite substantial, hundreds. This is a lady who owns this property, and again, iNaturalist, allowed me to get into contact with her in May 2022. She posted these images of these monarchs and her property clustering, and they've done it every year since, so 23 and 24. And I did hope to go there this year, but as I said, I didn't make it. But this is one of the biggest colonies currently going, I think. This picture was from this year. She estimated hundreds there still. So I hope to get there one day to look more closely at them. But it raises a lot of questions because it's there. It's on this little island in the middle of the Bass Strait, between mainland Australia and Tasmania. And Tasmania has very few monarch records, just occasional. And there's not much milkweed in Tasmania. It's too cold probably because it's so far south. In contrast, Flinders Island does have a lot of milkweed, and they do have summer populations of monarch butterflies. But and so that's why it deserves further study, this population, because all my work in Australia in the past has shown that they migrate and then overwinter, just like they do here. Is it possible, I'm wondering, if in this case they're not migrating, or maybe they're migrating from one end of the island to the other, in a strange direction, or maybe not, because they're going north, instead of coming from Victoria, which, as I said, doesn't have huge populations. South Australia, as we'll get to in a minute, does have bigger populations, and maybe we should be looking further afield, or Tasmania, perhaps, if there's populations we don't know about. It's unlikely. So it's a mystery that needs to be solved. So, I don't know, somebody needs to do a tagging program over there to find out where these monarchs are coming from. And really, the first thing we could do is tag the monarchs at Leaka in Flinders Island to see where they go to when they leave. And I did actually try to get the lady there, Maria, to do that, without success at this point. Anyway, so moving on to South Australia, which is the final state that I went to, and in some ways the most interesting to me, because it's this one that I began my monarch journey back in 1976. That's where I landed from England, and where I applied for jobs from and got the job in New South Wales. But so I have a soft spot for South Australia. I saw monarchs when I was there in South Australia, but didn't have time to study them at the time. So anyway, so there's, from iNaturalist clues, there are apparently 6 new sites. So I had the opportunity to go to 4. Well, I went to 6, but I'm just going to talk about 4. And the first one is a place called Normanville, which I go back, is down there on the south coast. And this was a new overwintering site, as I said, and it's a classic looking site, a gully site. Most of Australian sites are gullies. And Yahoo! I found 200 monarchs there estimated. A lot of them are in flight, some are roosting, but clearly an overwintering population. And this came from a clue from my naturalist of a couple of pictures showing a dozen monarchs on a branch together. So this was a north-south oriented gully site over about 1/3 of a mile. Beautiful place, as you can see. And looking at observations, I found them nectaring on European gorse. And so I've never seen them on gorse before. Not that I've seen much gorse, of course, but it's not something you'd expect to see them getting nectar from, I don't think. So that was intriguing to see them nectaring on that. And then the gully opened up at the southern end where western grey kangaroos were guarding the milkweed. So this is the milkweed in the front here. So this is a milkweed called wild cotton. I'll talk about more in a minute, but I was a bit reticent to approach them. Kangaroos, they were not like deer or elk that would run and get the hell out of there. They stand their ground, as you can see. I mean, I wasn't this close. I do have a good zoom lens, but they weren't in a hurry to move off. And kangaroos are known for disemboweling other animals and possibly people if you got too close. So the wild cotton is the milkweed that I showed there, and this is the closest shot of it, obviously. Gomphocarpus cancellatus. So another African milkweed, very different, very tough leaves, very robust plant, and quite large, as you saw from the previous picture, but quite beautiful in its own way, very ornamental looking, I guess, but it dominates in South Australia, which is remarkable because back in the 70s, 80s, and I don't know for how long before, it wasn't a thing. It wasn't there. I don't know when the first record was. It might have been that long ago, but it certainly wasn't common. But in between times, it's suddenly taken off. It's suddenly now become the dominant milkweed in South Australia, and it's very common. So it was uncommon. Now it's common, and the monarchs love it. I'm always thinking that finding large numbers of monarchs all congregating on this milkweed is a good telltale sign that a monarch colony is in the vicinity, because at all the sites in South Australia, that was the case. So there's no doubt that they do like this species. Oh, another bird. This bird has a place in my heart because it was I've always loved these galahs or rose-breasted cockatoos. And I actually had one as a pet for a long time. Even brought it to the US with me in the early days. Yeah, the beautiful birds. And I'll show a couple of pictures in a minute. But galah is as I soon learned in 1976, it's not a term of endearment. Australian guys often call other guys you galah, because they're calling you a fool or a silly person. So as well as being called a pom, which Australians called English people, they might sometimes call you a galah if they thought you were a fool or a silly person. So, which is a bit unfortunate for the rose-breasted cockatoos. But this is an old slide from back in the 70s, so poor quality. But you get these vast numbers we did in those days. I don't know if this still occurs, but on the trees as the sun's setting, making a lot of noise, but not a unpleasant noise. And a flock of galahs, just incredible seeing them wheel around, as a bit like starlings through here, in the sky, not as fast as starlings, but you do get flocks of galahs. And one of the reasons they're called galahs, I think, is because they have this habit of sitting on roads and not getting out the way when the traffic's coming in the country roads. And so that's really sad, because you'll often come across a spot where there's just pink feathers everywhere, where a number of galahs have been killed by traffic. Okay, moving on to the next overwintering site, which is right on the coast, a place called Seacliff, and this was the second iNaturalist clue site. And I was happy to see that it was already a conservation area. You know, and that's the great thing about Australia, that there's a lot of these conservation areas, and particularly in South Australia, I think they're far ahead, I think, in the idea of conserving areas, even small areas like this. And this is a tiny area, as you can see. It's only, what is it, 100 yards, I don't know, 100 yards long maybe. You can see the end. That is the end there. That's where the butterflies were overwintering. And just another 100 yards in this direction is the coast. And this whole little area, plus other bits of the coast to the right, are this conservation area. So that's great. And they were obviously well aware that gullies provide important homes. I mean, they didn't, I spoke to a couple of people there and they did not know about the monarchs. And, and if there's not thousands there, people tend not to notice them. So I've got to make myself a mental note to contact some of these South Australian people to let them know that monarchs are part of what they're doing, and to be aware of them. And anyway, so there were 75 butterflies there, overwintering butterflies, roosting, as you can see in the inset there. And the iNaturalist user back in April, who I communicated with, estimated 50. So they'd been there, from April to July, and that's, that might work in the 80s showed that they leave at the end of July and during August. So it was an overwintering population, and they were mostly roosting in this tree here, and that's where they were in April too. So a great little site. They were mostly basking. They had nectar sources there. I documented all the nectar sources they had. Most of them were Australian native plants, a couple of weedy species, but mostly natives. So the next site, moving on to another part of Adelaide near the Adelaide Hills. So there's a range of hills that run north-south in near Adelaide. I think I've got a map somewhere. Is it? No, what do I do with my map? I don't know. It'll pop up in a minute probably. So yeah, so this is the foothills. Slide's going crazy. So this is the foothills of the Adelaide Hills, a place called Ghost Tree Gully. And again, another iNaturalist clue. And walking in, from the suburbs again, this is a common sight. You see kangaroos, as you might see deer, I suppose in some suburban areas, just hanging out near the houses. And so I walked down to the gully again, another gully site, beautiful place. And you can see why it was it was named Ghost Gully, Ghost Tree Gully. These are mountain white gum trees, beautiful trees. And then I looking up at the trees, being a very observant naturalist still, I noticed something in the tree. I don't know if you can see it there, where my cursor is. If you can see the cursor, there's something in the tree there. And you're probably guessing what it is already, maybe. Oops. Which one have we got? There you go. The backside of a koala. And that's a painting that my father painted years ago of koala. He actually, because when I went to Australia, I bought him out and my mother and my sisters, and he found a new vocation, selling paintings, creating paintings of Australian wildlife and selling them, and did beautiful paintings of koalas and kookaburras and galahs and everything else. So yeah, so I got to see the backside of a koala. He never did show his face. He was fast asleep and totally unaware that I was down there with my zoom lens. Then I saw this duck. Duck was in the tree too. It's not, and I didn't know it was a duck. I should have guessed from the feet, I guess. But Australian wood duck in the trees. And then, meanwhile, back on the ground, back to the kangaroos, back where the milkweed was. It's like they hang out where the milkweed is. And it's just coincidence, I'm sure. But these kangaroos were even more, not going to say aggressive, but they were very bold and not giving up their ground. As you can see, they were the guardians of the milkweed kingdom, or so they thought. And so you can see the good shot of the milkweed there. but he's scratching himself and wondering if I'm coming over. Actually, I think he was lying down prior to me, prior to me disturbing him. So he's probably upset him in the first place. But this is the magical little milkweed kingdom here. There's the milkweed growing there, and there were a few butterflies here, not many, but just a few. And this is the site that they were found in larger numbers a couple of years ago. The iNaturalist clue was 2016, I think. And so, although I didn't see definitive evidence of overwintering, there was enough there to make me think there was something going on. That was the site anyway. And finally, there was another site, and this site was at Salisbury North, which was just a hop and a skip from where I landed, or where I first resided when I arrived in Australia in 1976. I could have walked here from where I was, and so I doubt that this was there then, because this is another example of the Australian. Another example of Australian authorities making a conservation area from another gorge, gully, creek area in the middle of suburbia, and this is again another shot of it, but it's in a suburban area, and it's a conservation area, quite a substantial one too. And then I came across this strange looking plant. And I was shocked to see there was actually a monarch on it. And this is literally how I found it. I just came across it and just looked closer, and it was almost sort of camouflaged there, just sitting on their nectarine. And this is the Mount Lofty grass tree. It's a South Australian endemic species, so quite rare as well, but present in this gully. And the monarchs, well, this couple of monarchs I saw at the time were feeding on it, along with a whole bunch of bees, honeybees. But yeah, so that's, that probably takes the prize for most unusual nectar plant for a monarch. But of course, the wild cotton milkweed was there as well, towards just a certain area of the gully, and of course that's where I found the butterflies. And there was an estimated population, about 25, in a small area. Again, I think a likely overwintering area at this site. And again, there were some caterpillars, actually for the first time in South Australia anyway, caterpillars on the cotton bush, outlined there in the circles, mature larvae. So yeah, and the population of monarchs in South Australia does appear to be, judging from iNaturalists, is a greater population in this state than the other states, which did not used to be the case 40 years ago. So my summary of my quick trip down there, I was down there for 4 weeks, traveling around, but it was a snapshot in time, as I said, and the numbers at the old sites were way down from the 1980s, but that may have been just a bad year, who knows. I need to do it more often, or somebody needs to look at them more often to gauge the true status of the population. Populations were best in South Australia, as I said, and I'm happy to confirm 4 new sites. And the other 2 sites I didn't find, and so still need to look at those. But if they're like the other 4, they're likely to be sites, and there's probably other sites as well. So iNaturalist clues are valuable for finding new sites. The more people move around and look around and take pictures and put them on iNaturalist, we're going to find more. And so it's incumbent on people like me, I guess, to go and check them out and make sure they really are new sites, and to let authorities know, like the people that manage the areas, to let them know that they are sites for these butterflies overwintering. And so lessons from Australian monarchs over the years for Western US monarchs. Oops, I can't change this thing here. I got trouble moving something on my screen. Oh, there you go. Okay, so I mean, basically, it's adaptability and resilience. I mean, that's if I had to pick just, two things um, that that the monarch has taught me throughout my time of studying it and looking at it. And back in the 70s, I used to try and be the monarch, try and think like a monarch, and really get into the feeling of being a monarch. And and to just seeing how adaptable and resilient it is just the thing that I've taken on board. And even before, if I missed the slide, haven't I should have gone back to the other one. Yeah, the lessons that came before that one. And I can't move this thing. Okay, so continued adaptation to a changing environment is obviously a big thing. And winter breeding in California, we've seen in some years, and it's going to be more prevalent in some years than others, depending on what happens during the autumn as the monarchs migrate there. And that's probably is what is happening in Australia too, and why populations that the overwintering sites, anecdotally anyway, are bigger some years than others, because some years they're probably breeding more than they are you know overwintering as non reproductive populations, again on what the conditions are in the autumn, and why we're not getting clusters every year at Oxley. So it is, the two places are mirroring each other. And so, the Thanksgiving counts that Xerxes conducts will not always provide a good assessment of Western monarch numbers because of this, because they're not going to be taking account of these breeders. They can't be counted. So we always, I think in the future, will have to bear that in mind. In some years, they may not be as reliable. And populations will rise and fall as adaptation occurs. As the butterfly adapts to different conditions, it will go through bad times. Populations will lower and then increase again. But the one thing is pretty sure in my mind, that it will not go extinct. The butterfly will not go extinct. So don't let anybody tell you that the butterfly is going to go extinct. And as I said earlier, adaptability and resilience is what the butterflies taught me personally. I guess that I was going to say. Okay, well, thank you for bearing with me and getting to the end. And my last slide is the British monarch, of course, which is pretty appropriate, I guess. And I was happy to see this official painting, which a lot of people criticise, but it does have a monarch in it on his flying above his shoulder there. And he's always been an advocate, even when I was a kid, and advocating for conservation myself. I noted that he was too, back in 1970s, early 1970s. So it's good. And so it's probably a fitting final slide. And I have to thank so many people. I can't mention them all, but my mum and dad, obviously, were helped me become who I am and encouraged my work in the past, and never criticized it. I still can't move this thing. Oh, there you go. My sisters, Teresa and Debbie, of course, and my wife, Tanya, and daughters, who the Vanessids, my PhD supervisor, who, she helped me through my part-time degree. And so I've just got back in contact with her recently, which has been a great thrill. So yeah, she helped so much in getting me on the right track to be, go from the masters to the PhD, etc. And a number of mentors over the year, both in England, Peter Payne, Michael Clark, who you won't know, and Vic Edge, who was my boss in the Department of Agriculture in Sydney, who allowed me to work on the Monarch, and Lincoln Brower, who you will know, and of course Bob Pyle, who you do know, and John Pelham and Dave Nunnally here. You've all helped greatly in mentoring me with butterflies and being the person I am today. And to the hundreds of people who have helped me in my monarch research over decades in Australia, and the US. I mean, so many people have helped in the field, including all the citizen scientists of recent times, and that continue helping to this very day. So thank you all, and thank you all for listening to this rather long talk, but I hope it was a little bit more interesting perhaps than the straight research presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. That was really wonderful. I've gotten some comments in the chat about how people really enjoyed both your journey, but also the photographs of the wildlife that you have shown too. So it's a very exotic place. So it's lovely. So are there any questions? We'll open it up for anybody who wants to check in.
I would just say, David, thank you so much for including the galah. I love that bird. I love all the Australian birds,
Yeah.
parrots especially, but that one is so lovely and so confiding
I
and
know.
easy to watch, pleasant to listen to. And you cut it just right, that the big flight, first the basking and the big flight into the sunset with all those pink breasts and those beautiful dove gray backs. Is such a beautiful bird. And I was called a galah more than once when I was there. So
I'm
I
glad you
appreciate
saw
that
them.
part.
Glad you saw them.
I said, thank you.
So I had a question about milkweeds. I guess I thought all milkweeds were Asclepias. Is it, does it encompass a number of genera or?
It's the African milkweeds are all Gomphocarpus. I don't know the
Oh,
taxonomy of them really, but
okay.
that seems to be the case for some reason, that they are a different group of milkweeds. Yeah,
And the Asclepias are from another,
yeah, they're North American, all North American.
oh, I see. Okay, okay.
Same family though, all Asclepiadaceae,
Same family.
Yeah,
Yeah,
same
okay.
family.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. Okay, any other comments or questions?
I see one question there on the chat about farming in Australia affecting monarchs. That's interesting because that's at the time I did my work, that was what I blamed on the demise of the monarch at that time, because I did see, working in agriculture, I was seeing a lot of farmers getting rid of milkweed. So that was a thing that was happening, and I attributed the decline at that time. I probably mentioned it in my PhD, I'm sure, more than climate. I wasn't really thinking of climate at that time. So yes, I think that could have been a big reason for the decline. And in Australia, because in the summer it is very hot, the milkweed doesn't do so well, like showy milkweed, in Washington, these riparian areas. Well, the African milkweeds are even more vulnerable to the heat, and they need riparian zones, and there's less of them in Australian outback areas, there seems to be anyway, than in Washington, for example. So farmland probably is and was, is a great source area for the monarch. So yes, farmland probably has been a big contributor to the decline there.
There's also another question from Regina about the trees that monarchs use for overwintering.
Yeah, they're mostly eucalyptus, which you wouldn't be surprised about that, really, would you? Because eucalyptus are dominant. But there are other trees. In fact, I think on the recent one on the island in Brisbane, they're on casuarina, which is another Australian, like a weeping willow type species or group of plants, trees. And you saw the Norfolk Island pine. Melaleuca's another family of Australian trees that they use. So it's like here, they're not particularly fussy about what tree they roost on. It's more to do with the actual habitat, the site, rather than the actual tree. So yeah, but because eucalyptus dominate, they use them mostly. And a bit like I could be talking about California because it's the same story there.
So the European Union is becoming much more concerned about the use of neonicotinoids, and there's a increasing awareness here in the US. Do you know what the situation is in Australia?
As far as I know, well, they're still using them. They're a bit like us. I don't think there's any big move to curtail their use. At least I haven't heard about it anyway, which is a bit surprising because they tend to follow Europe in pesticide protocols very quickly. You know, I probably mentioned this story before about the fact that you know there's less chemicals being used in Australian agriculture, mainly because the crops are exported to Europe, and Europe residues won't allow you know, those pesticides. So yeah, I'm a bit surprised about that. But as far as I know, they haven't really. They certainly are using them still. I know that. Another question from the chat I see about OE. How is it over there? It's certainly prevalent in Queensland. Again, it's like in the US, it's more prevalent in the tropical areas like the South and Florida and Hawaii. It's the same in Australia. It's in the year-round breeding populations. I didn't mention that, you know, so you've got overwintering populations in Brisbane now, but most of the populations in Brisbane are year-round breeding populations, and and uh, and so yeah, OE prevalence is high in those populations. Whereas in New South Wales, where I was working, it was it was rare. It did occur, but it wasn't common. If you mass reared butterflies like I was, it was a long time before you had any problems with OE. Unlike here, where you know you only need to rear them for a generation or so before you get it. So yeah, it's there, but only in the tropical areas.
So I don't know if you're seeing the chat, David,
Yeah.
but there's a question about what OE is.
Yeah, sorry, Stuart.
And
Stuart,
then
OE
also,
is a protozoan parasite that monarchs have affected by, particularly in tropical areas, as I said. It's a natural parasite, but it can debilitate them when it's in large numbers, particularly if you're mass rearing them or in captivity.
and then another comment about whether it's increasing in overwintering areas where the milkweed doesn't die back.
No, well, that's no. I mean, those. If you're talking about Australia, nobody's done those studies, of course. I mean, you know, in the when I was working on them, they were overwintering and they didn't have OE. I didn't check for OE as much as I do now or would now, but I did check. You know, I was aware of OE at the time since I did get OE, and I'm pretty sure that very few butterflies, wild butterflies, overwintering sites with milkweed had OE. I don't recall any, but OE wasn't the focus of my research. So it's something we need to look at probably. So yeah, I can't really give a good answer to that question.
How do you detect it?
It's quite simple, really. You just put a bit of you hold the abdomen and put a bit of sticky tape to the abdomen and put it on a slide and look at it under a microscope. And you can under 100 times you can identify these little football-shaped spores, and so it's pretty characteristic and easy to do. So I've done a lot in Washington, and it's rare. You know, when we had monarchs at Crab Creek, you know, it was rare. I have the data somewhere, I haven't published that, but it was a rarity. So we do get it, and that's, I think, be the situation in Australia, in New South Wales. It'll be there, but just rare.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you so much, David. That was a wonderful tour, and I think we are all just dying to go to Australia now.
Yeah, hope you all do get the chance to. I mean, one thing that always sticks in my mind is that, you know, when I meet an American that's been there, they say they're just blown away by it. They love the place and they want to go back, and they often say it's like America used to be, whatever that means.
Probably the good parts and the bad parts. Okay, well, thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Really
Thank you all.
appreciate your giving this wonderful presentation to us tonight. And I do want to mention that next month we're going to have Carter Earns talk about his field work on the Olympic Peninsula. So he's done some trekking around in places that people don't tend to go, and I think his talk will be very interesting. So we'll look forward to seeing you all then, and thank you very much for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you all.
Good night,
All right,
everyone.
David.